Hi everyone, Philip Swain's my name and I'm the National President of Environmental Health Australia. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Environmental Health Australia's live chat event to celebrate World Environmental Health Day 2021. I'm sure most of you know what environmental health is, but if you're unsure, simply put, environmental health focuses on a person's health dependent on their environment. Our environmental health officers work to protect their communities from environmental concerns that impact things like food safety, noise pollution, air quality, diseases, and so much more. This year's theme for World Environmental Health Day, prioritising environmental health for healthy communities in global recovery. Environmental health has a crucial role to play in disease and pandemic control, and environmental health officers have been at the forefront of the COVID response efforts. Since the pandemic began, the environmental health workforce here in Australia have been involved in pandemic control measures to varying degrees. In some states, involvement has been minimal, such as monitoring food businesses and public venues for contact tracing registers. In other states, our EHOs and other environmental health professionals have been called upon to assist in contact tracing, organising testing facilities and vaccination sites, and numerous other activities associated with the pandemic response. The core of environmental health work in Australia has been for many decades the running and promotion of immunisation programs and conversely infectious disease investigations. If we think about this in terms of an endemic virus, and we're not there yet, we're still in an epidemic, what is the role of our profession into the future? Many of us will undoubtedly have key roles to play. Today we'll be hearing from some fantastic environmental health professionals, and we'll open up questions for 5 minutes after each speaker presentation. To ask a speaker a question, simply type a comment below, and you're welcome to comment at any time, and questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Our first speaker is joining us all the way from America in Denver. Madeline Gustafson is a project coordinator with the National Environmental Health Association in the US, and she primarily works on climate and health, environmental health tracking, the Model Aquatic Health Code, and preparedness programs. She also manages the Vector Program Committee, Climate and Health Committee, as well as the Preparation Program Committee. Welcome, Maddie.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Madeline Gustafson, and I'm a project coordinator at NEHA. NEHA is based out of Denver, Colorado, in the United States, and we work to build, sustain, and empower an effective environmental health workforce. NEHA currently serves over 6,000 members through training, credentialing, high-quality resources, and professional development. We also provide a space for environmental health professionals to share their expertise and work through community engagement, surveying members, and an annual educational conference. This World Environmental Health Day's 2021 theme is prioritizing environmental health for healthier communities in global recovery. This year, we're reflecting on the past 19 months and more of the COVID-19 pandemic. So much has changed how we live, work, and play, but one element to this response that has remained consistent is the role and persistence of the environmental health workforce. In July and August of 2020, we surveyed the EH workforce and posted a report in October. This highlights the impacts of COVID-19 on the profession. There's a few findings I want to share with you today that we have from this report. Respondents from all workforce categories have experienced increased responsibilities outside their typical scope of work. We found that every single workforce category had at least 50% of the respondents agree their responsibilities have changed with COVID. 89% of local, 82% of state, 56% of federal, 78% of tribal, and 100% of territorial environmental health professionals. Respondents were asked to rate their agreement on whether they feel they have been sufficiently trained to complete these assigned duties. Respondents from state and local EH programs reported the most inadequate training, state at 23% of the respondents and local at 21%. There was a substantial number of respondents who also agreed or strongly agreed that they are experiencing burnout symptoms, including feeling more emotionally exhausted, feeling worn out at the end of the workday, and many other symptoms. Other symptoms of burnout reported included feeling that every working hour is tiring, feeling exhausted thinking about another workday, and feeling frustrated about their work. As burnout symptoms progressed, respondents tend to agree or strongly agree more. Most respondents across workforce categories feel emotionally exhausted. In terms of being emotionally exhausted, 100% of the respondents from U.S. territory EH programs agreed, followed by 80% of local, 74% of uniformed services, 72% of state, 67% of tribal, and 64% of federal EH programs reported emotional exhaustion. As this data indicates, the EH workforce is experiencing high levels of burnout due to COVID-19. As we lean forward into the future, I want to highlight 3 areas of the COVID-19 pandemic and the valuable environmental health workforce. 1, the role of EH in concurrent disasters. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been challenged with responding to more than one disaster at a time. COVID-19 and the recent Hurricane Ida, COVID-19 and wildfires in Colorado, flooding in the Midwest, severe storms in Australia, and as I hear an recent earthquake, severe flooding in Malaysia and United Kingdom, earthquakes and tsunamis in New Zealand. As we consider responding to these disasters, EH is at the forefront of the response and recovery to these disasters in COVID-19. A few examples within the last year of concurrent disasters I want to share with you are the opening of recovery and response shelters with the new infection prevention and control measures we're all accustomed to. Prior to COVID-19, disaster shelters were built without infection prevention and control measures that we all now use in our daily lives. This includes mask wearing, ventilation, and social distancing. Setting up community shelters in a time of disaster have modified to adjust to this new normal. Another example is the continuous increase in wildfires across the United States and Canada. With the increased smoke exposure and poor air quality, we often encourage folks to stay indoors. However, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're encouraging people to do the opposite. Spend as much time outside as possible and use proper ventilation. This is a major concurrent disasters concern that public and environmental health professionals have been faced with. Climate change will continue to threaten millions with the unique expertise and experience, the EH workforce has a major role in preventing and responding to concurrent disasters. 2, the role of environmental strike teams. Strike teams are groups of EH professionals that are trained and prepped with response equipment for disasters. The EH workforce can quickly address and respond to hazards. Environmental health hazards aren't often the first thing you notice in a disaster. And in many scenarios, if you wait until you notice them, it's far too late. EH professionals can recognize these hazards in infection control, wastewater infrastructure systems, contaminated water and food, as well as vector control. Strike teams also carry go bags filled with supplies they may need as they respond to the disasters. These items include first aid kits, gloves, flashlights, insect repellent, and more. The state of Georgia is a great example of an EH strike team program that has been implemented. They have divided the state into 5 regions with 2 teams per region, with a primary and a backup team. Each team has about 6 members. The teams respond to disasters within the first few days to address and notify state and federal agencies of any health hazards. Based on the assessments completed, the team will develop a plan moving forward. The plan may include things like well water sampling, vector prevention, setting up shelters, and more. NEHA is working to develop a national standard, which we hope to publish in the next 4 to 6 weeks. The standard works to inform, train, deploy, and equip EH strike teams. Equipping communities and local, state, tribal, and territorial health departments with strike teams can reduce the health outcomes from local environmental impacts. And finally, 3, the environmental health workforce is the glue. EH professionals continue to be the boots on the ground out in the field profession in the public health world. With the second largest public health workforce behind public health nursing, professionals have the unique ability to work across sectors and connect many different key partners and players in public health. The workforce has continuous engagement with the community, allowing relationships to build and communication pathways to form. This is important in building community resilience and response and recovery efforts. NEHA is pleased to be joining this fantastic group of environmental professionals for World Environmental Health Day, and we look forward to continuing this ongoing partnership. These partnerships demonstrate how important strong connections are in and motivates us all in a time of disaster. I want to thank everyone at Environmental Health Australia, my fellow speakers, and the biggest thank you to all the environmental professionals around the world for your support, protecting your local communities, and your ongoing dedication to public and environmental health. We see you, we hear you, and we thank you for your hard work in the field. I will now be open to your questions.
Thanks so much for the presentation, Maddie. And what a great intro to all sorts of subjects that we're getting into today, and a great overview. I'm just wondering, with the Georgia team or strike teams that you mentioned, is there any examples where they've actually been called upon to date, or is it sort of still in its infancy?
It's my understanding it's still in its infancy, but I do know that they're working to put together some indications and indicators for assessments and evaluations of how that will happen in the future, so we can hopefully reuse and repurpose their excellent strike team that they have in that state.
Sure, and be very interested to see the national standards when they become available. Sounds like a great tool for environmental professionals, and something that can probably be adapted all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely, and I will be sure to share that with the partners on this call when that's developed and shared.
Okay, we've had a question pop up there. I hope you can see it.
Yeah, what work is NEHA doing on preparedness and climate? So we have a few different funded projects. I'll start with preparedness. We have a few funded projects through the CDC. Different areas include concurrent disasters and strike teams, like I talked about today, as well as a leadership academy that we've started. It's a year-long academy for professionals to mid-level professionals to get a little bit of leadership experience, pulling in some of those preparedness elements for a year-long interactive experience. We also have a project where we provide pass-through funding to jurisdictions that have been impacted by disasters in different years. So we provide to them what they still need in terms of funding to address those disasters. And then we also have a committee that has about 10 to 12 members based on the year from around the country that kind of fill in the gaps that some of our funded projects don't address. So we do things like blog posts and webinars and fun Twitter chats and things like that. So that is the preparedness side. And on climate, that is something I also work on. We are actually currently working on an interactive GIS storytelling map, which I'm really excited about. We're hoping as you scroll through the map, you'll see the regional impacts of climate change and some of the recent disasters and how you can respond to that, as well as some storytelling elements of local stories and climate justice initiatives. So that's another example of things that we're working on in climate. And we also have a committee there, just like the preparedness one, and an online community for NEHA members to participate in discussion posts and share resources. And like I said, some of that membership and community engagement that folks can participate in. So yeah. What other surveys have you demonstrated to NEHA members during the COVID-19 pandemic? So two, I just want to highlight. We conducted a climate affiliate survey. So we have 50 affiliates, one for each state, and our board of directors And we disseminated the survey out to the affiliates to get their perceptions on on climate change and their perceptions moving forward, values and different things like that, and what they feel their states think about those topics. And we're putting together through our committee a report on some of those findings. So that was one. And another one I wanted to mention is our concurrent disasters needs assessment. So that is something that is currently in the works, and we're hoping to get that out shortly. One other little things, I know it's not a survey, but something I'm excited about, kind of similar to gauging other members' perceptions and experiences in environmental health. We've conducted a podcast series. So we have 4 different health departments that talk about their experience in environmental health data and tracking. So stay tuned for that as well.
Thanks very much, Maddie.
Thank you so much.
I'm continually impressed with NEHA's ability to engage with your membership, and the question is, and the ability to, I saw the workforce work that you've done a couple of years ago. I've been pushing very hard in Australia for a similar thing to be done here with the engagement with the workforce and actually getting a clear picture of what's going on with environmental health in America. Mm-hmm. So, and thank you so much for the presentation.
Absolutely.
That's been great. I know it's late over there, so we'll let you go. Feel free to stay on if you wish, but I'm sure you probably long overdue for a rest on a very long day.
No worries at all.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Now we'll be speaking with Tanya Morrison, National President of the New Zealand Institute of Environmental Health and an Environmental Health Officer in New Zealand for over 10 years. Her key areas of interest within environmental health include food safety, swimming pool water quality, noise control, and the appearance industries such as tattooing, beauty therapy, and skin piercing. Welcoming Tanya. Thank you for joining us, Tanya. It's always a pleasure to hear from our colleagues over the ditch. Over to you.
Kia ora, Phil, and hello everyone watching. First and foremost, big thank you to Environmental Health Australia for inviting myself on behalf of our New Zealand Institute to be a part of your Facebook Live chat today. Great initiative to help celebrate World Environmental Health Day. So again, thank you so much for everyone involved putting this together. With the theme, obviously, this year of World Environmental Health Day internationally being prioritising environmental health and the healthy communities and the global recovery, I wanted to take a little slightly different spin on things today, as opposed to focusing on the pandemic as such, which it is obviously very easy to do. But in thinking about putting this presentation together, I was also thinking about the One Health concept, which is something that came about through discussions with our Australian colleagues. And so one thing that came to mind to me was, the essential elements to health and indeed our environment. And one of the key ones there is water. So as we're all no doubt aware that water is essential to life, and indeed you can obviously go a lot longer without food, for example, than you can without water. In the face of climate change and other challenges around the world, though, it's arguable that water is becoming more and more of a scarce commodity. And often I think maybe water is underappreciated for how much we actually use it and rely on it. And perhaps it's not until, for whatever reason, we don't have it the way we would like to have it, or the availability of it is compromised some other way, that we perhaps realise its value even more so. If Sam would be so kind just to flick on to the next slide for me. She's controlling my slides today. Thank you, Sam. I remember travelling around America in 2015. Those were the days when we could obviously travel freely. And this is a photo that I actually took of the Hoover Dam that you'll see on your screens. So the picture here, what was amazing to me about this, and the whole reason I wanted to take a photo, is hopefully you can clearly see where the water level once was in the dam. So this is just a really visual impact of how climate change arguably is obviously affecting water availability all around the globe. Now, this is just one example. I know there's many parts of the states. I know even California, for example, they've been in a state of drought for many, many years. And that's not unique to Australia, to America, but also parts of Australia, at times and different seasons here in New Zealand, anywhere in the world, this can happen. So it really does demonstrate that Mother Nature doesn't really choose, who and where and when. It can happen anywhere. So places that that concept of our resources can be limited for varying reasons. So if we think about in developed countries, perhaps we too take the availability of fresh, clean drinking water for granted at times. Essentially, you turn the tap and out it comes. So you might be right to think that little thought might go into how that water came to be for most people. The work that goes into treating it, where it's actually come from, to make it potable and drinkable in the first place. So whilst this won't be new knowledge to everyone, if we take a moment just to recap the obvious uses that we have for water. Now, drinking, of course, is very obvious, as is cooking for our food, cleaning, washing. Now, that's everything from washing dishes to washing ourselves, our cars, our windows. You've got pets and animals drinking water, plants and gardens needing water to survive. And then there's the recreational use of water as well, such as swimming pools, also recreational uses of swimming for lakes, rivers, oceans. Water is used in industries, it's used to generate electricity. And then there's the flip side of our clean water that's available, and that's our wastewater and what happens to that. Oftentimes it just goes down the sink, down the drain, and perhaps we don't even give a second thought as to what happens next on its journey. So in certain parts of the world, for example, I know, in Australia, in the outback, I'm sure there'll be some great examples that won't be hard to find where wastewater needs to be reused for a treatment process to actually enable it to be repurposed. In fact, I believe that some amazing technology and things are happening where water can be reused 7 to 9 times on average if it's treated properly after each use. And that's quite an amazing feat when you think about it. But unless you live in a part of the world where that treatment and recycling of water is crucial, perhaps it's underappreciated, and arguably a lot of water is actually wasted around the globe on a daily basis. So if you flick on to the next slide, please, Sam. Taking a wee step back and looking at it from another angle, there's also the less developed parts of the world to consider, where basic sanitation systems in general may barely exist, if at all, and having water availability for drinking, let alone hand washing, showering and other uses can be hard to achieve. And as we know in the face of a global pandemic where something as simple as hand washing and basic sanitation has had a massive role in how COVID-19 can be combated or to a degree managed, that's quite an important thing to keep in mind. Some crude methods of water treatment sometimes have to be employed, and one such example of that can be actually putting water into plastic bottles and leaving it out in the sunlight for natural UV light to try and destroy some harmful pathogens that might be present. Whereas if we go back to our developed countries, again, we're very lucky to have that water freely available where you just turn on the tap. So even in times of that drought or extreme weather, we might be told to ration or to restrict our use of water. Sometimes we just see that as an inconvenience. Now that speaks to the level of expectation and also the level of trust that we put into our water systems and networks. We just trust that we turn on the tap and something's going to be there. It's going to be safe to drink or for us to otherwise use. So I'd like to focus briefly just on a couple of instances in New Zealand within recent years where arguably that trust of our water has been betrayed or put to the test, shall we say, for different reasons. So if you flip to the next slide, please, Sam. Some of you may recall or have heard about a few years ago now, it was back in August 2016, a place in the North Island, Havelock North, we had New Zealand's largest recorded outbreak of waterborne disease. Now, this was to do with Campylobacter that entered the town's water supply after the runoff from a nearby sheep farm entered into the boreholes following heavy rain. So what actually happened here, just in a very brief overview, the town has approximately 13,000 or so residents. About 5,500 of those residents actually fell ill. 45 people were hospitalised and unfortunately 4 people died. There was not only issues with the catchment area that meant the runoff after the heavy rain could enter the boreholes, but there were other systematic failures identified that, in hindsight, gave a major wake-up call to the state of many smaller drinking water supplies in New Zealand. And more recently, if we flick on to the next slide, please, Sam, where I'm based in New Zealand, in Dunedin in the Lower South Island, we actually had a do not drink the water notice issued. Now, this is not a boil water notice. This was a do not drink notice. And this came about due to high levels of lead being detected within our drinking water supply. The notice actually remained in effect for nearly 6 months, and it was only about a month or so that this notice was actually lifted. So the part of the city that this actually affected is a semi-rural township, approximately 35, 40 minutes drive north of the central business district. So it wasn't the main city itself, so slightly more rural residential area. And when the news first broke out about this lead in the water, it's fair to say the community were outraged. They had many questions, not least of which was, where did this contamination come from? How did this happen? What is the risk to me? What's the possible health effects? All sorts of worry and confusion set in. How long have I been drinking this water? What does this all mean? So a large-scale investigation into the reasons behind the high lead results began, and also free blood tests were arranged for all members of the community to test their lead levels. Now, thankfully, the results came back in general within all the acceptable levels, besides a couple of instances where other events of exposure perhaps could be explained, for example, through someone's workplace exposure or some other activity. But in general, again, when this news broke and the notice was put in place, then obviously this whole community needed drinking water. So water tankers were sent up from the city, that 35, 40-minute drive north, and multiple stations were set up where containers of drinking water could be filled. And this turned into a semi-permanent situation where tankers were in place for nearly 6 months while the notice was still in effect for locals to go and get drinking water. Now, as time goes on, many members of the community, again, perhaps came a little bit complacent and just decided to continue using the water. They felt fine, so why not? Even similar to the Havelock North experience, if you look at the qualities of water and it tastes okay and it looks okay, it's like an invisible threat at times. But what the health officials are telling people is it's not safe. So the investigation into how that lead came about covered many avenues, all of which were thoroughly explored. But ultimately, it was thought that samples from a few select locations that kept showing intermittent spikes, albeit not necessarily at levels that were above the acceptable limits for drinking water, was the most likely source of contamination. So that was to do with taps and pipework at some of the sampling points, coupled with a lack of flushing the taps to remove that residual water before not only was water drunk, but actually before the samples were taken. So part of the advice the health professionals released when the notice was lifted was that everyone should be flushing their taps quite regularly. So for example, when you get up in the morning, you should actually run your tap for a little bit, up to even, for example, 30 seconds before you start drinking the water, so that you're actually flushing out the water that's been sitting idle in your pipework overnight. Another interesting, speaking of flushing water, event that happened, a little offside of the COVID-19 pandemic, New Zealand has recently, in the last month or so, been entered back into a nationwide snap lockdown in the middle of August. And we're only just starting to come out of that now with most parts of New Zealand down to our alert level 2 out of our 4 alert levels, and Auckland region is still in alert level 3 restrictions. So with businesses closed for a good 2 weeks or so at the nationwide level 4 lockdown, within the CBD district, suddenly there was another problem on the rise in relation to water, and that was the chlorine levels. As the water wasn't flowing through the distribution network as it normally would in relatively high volumes, an excessive amount of chlorine in the water network was beginning to build up. So the only real way to solve this problem is through different points in the network was actually to flush the water out to reduce the chlorine levels. Now, the reality is that's probably the only real way you can prevent or reduce the chlorine buildup. But ultimately, if you think about it from another perspective, it's also wasting a lot of water and having to flush that without being used for any other purpose. So bringing this all back into the One Health concept and how environmental health interjects into our water use worldwide, it'll be no secret to anyone in the profession that we in environmental health actually deal with water all the time, even if we don't exactly realise it. So whether that would be checking food premises and their use of potable, treated water, looking at treatment systems for drinking or wastewater, sewage systems, recreational water uses such as swimming pools, monitoring of water in lakes, for example, we actually have quite a varied and wide involvement with water. So environmental health is at the heart of many water-related issues around the world. Even sometimes, though, that involvement might be secondary to our drinking water assessors, our drinking and wastewater technicians. We still have a role to play, and generally it all relates back to the ethos of environmental health. And the reason most of us do this job is because we're trying to protect and promote public health. The saying of "we worry so you don't have to" is so true of the environmental health profession. You shouldn't have to fear water coming out of the tap not being drinkable, any more than you should fear going for a swim at a swimming pool and not having your hair too green or otherwise becoming ill. So in recognition of World Environmental Health Day this year, I think this is a great time for us to stop and reflect and acknowledge the many hands that go into ensuring that the many uses of water and many other resources and parts of environmental health and all the systems are maintained, the safety, the security, the trust that we're building up allows people just to live their lives, and we can continue to be the invisible profession from the point of view that we're in the background making sure that public health is protected and also promoted when we get the chance. So though the environment and the climate is obviously changing and it's presenting many, many challenges all the time to our available resources, not least of which is made slightly more difficult with a global pandemic, water, as an example that I focused on today, is definitely on that list of resources that we want to protect, because ultimately it's the key of life. So I'm more than happy to take any questions if anyone's got any.
Thanks, Tanya. And that's a great thought-provoking presentation. I've often reflected on the irony that we live in a world which is greatly concerned about rising sea levels and at the same time numerous issues in relation to water and particularly potable water. So, and a great example there of where something like heavy rainfall and the storms impacted on a drinking water supply. So hopefully we've got a question or two. There's one's popped up there. Over to you.
Okay. So the outbreak in Havelock North solely caused by runoff from a nearby farm. No, not actually. Obviously just glancing over this briefly today with limited time, it was definitely one of the main contributing factors, in fact, probably the major contamination source for the outbreak. However, a lack of routine maintenance, regular water testing, and just authorities and different agencies working together cohesively actually all contributed to this outbreak. You could argue that if any one of those factors perhaps had been slightly better managed, then the outbreak could look a little bit different. Perhaps it wouldn't have occurred at all. But it was a bit of a wake-up call for the New Zealand drinking water standards and systems in place, especially around the small drinking water supplies, and that, you know, systems, checks and balances are in place for a reason, and that multi-agency cooperation is crucial to ensuring that there aren't failures like that that can potentially have devastating effects. The lead contamination. So what was the cause of that? So it was ultimately thought to be down to some pipe works and fittings actually on private property where some of the water samples were taken. And as I mentioned, the lack of flushing the taps out before some of the samples were taken, that's ultimately what we think was the most likely cause. To be honest, we may never really know for sure exactly what the cause was, but that's the best guess. The investigation was pretty thorough and it looked at multiple things. For example, we looked at some very old parts of the network and piping in this community. So that work that was already planned for 5 to 10 years' time got sped up. So a whole lot of pipes were replaced with some urgency. The catchment area was assessed, looking in to see if there was any old unmarked landfills or other sources where lead could enter the catchment area. The main holding reservoir of water was actually drained and cleaned. The sediment was tested. There was over 2,000 water samples taken during the investigation. And actually the local council here, we actually purchased a specific lead testing unit from Belgium, I think it was. And that's been installed near with the treatment plant as well. So our monitoring moving forward is actually so much better than it was. So yeah, a lot went into that investigation, but the likely source we do believe was just down to individual fittings and pipe work. Do the environmental health officers in New Zealand receive specialist water training as part of their qualification? Yeah, so through Massey University is our main university in New Zealand. There's also AUT, Auckland University, run the environmental health qualifications. There is a water and waste paper through Massey University, so that literally covers, I guess, the inputs of the drinking water side of things and also the outputs for the wastewater. So it is a part of the qualification. Building on that is obviously just on-site training. It depends where you are in New Zealand as an environmental health officer. Some councils, you might be the sole EHO, so you might be the jack of all trades, so you'll be a lot more involved in the water side of things or the wastewater. In other councils that are larger, you might have specialist departments, so you're less involved. So you might only deal with water, for example, in a food premises context or something like that. So it's a little bit varied, but it is actually a part of the qualification if you train within New Zealand.
Thanks, Tanya, for your presentation. That was great. And like I said, very topical, very thought-provoking, particularly in the scheme of things at the moment. So thanks again. I note that we had a case in Western Australia with lead in water in conjunction with the opening of one of our children's hospitals of all places. And that actually came down to brass plumbing fittings. So it was lead leaching from brass plumbing fittings. So, and that was in a brand new building. So core environmental health work for sure. But thank you very much for your presentation.
No worries. Thanks, Phil.
We're now joined by Dr. Andrew Matheson, who is a Director of Environmental Health in New South Wales with Environmental Health Australia. He's the Education Director with the International Federation of Environmental Health and a Senior Lecturer in the College of Health and Medicine at the Australian National University. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Phil. I have a short presentation to give, that's okay. And thanks to Tanya for a great presentation on water. Reminds me of a story when I was working as an environmental health officer in Scotland. We came across a problem in an area called the Lead Hills. Now, the clue's in the title. And we found that the people who were taking the drinking water straight out of these beautiful springs on the hill, Lead Hills, were having ridiculous levels of lead. And when people started looking into the story and looking into the history of the area, the area has been known as a problem for years. They didn't understand the toxicity of the lead, but there was so much lead there, and actually recurring lead, that the Romans used to actually sort of mine it. So the tailings were actually contaminating the sort of where the water was actually sort of uncontaminated. The tailings in the water from the mining sort of 2,000 years ago was still giving enough contamination to actually push it past the drinking regulations and actually make it unusable, which becomes sort of quite a challenge when it's an environmental toxicity and environmental contamination. How you actually sort of clear up? Do you go and dig out the tailings from 2,000 years ago, or what you do? In the end, they actually had to stop people using the water and actually sort of created a distribution system that had to dilute the water to an acceptable level, but it still had lead in the water. Quite a challenging problem. Anyway, thank you for the invitation from Environmental Health Australia to actually sort of do a presentation. I'm going to talk about environmental health, what I believe is one of the unsung heroes of protecting public health. And a lot of challenge in my grammar for the title. Should it say the unsung hero protecting the public health, or sort of protecting public's health? So I left it as it is in the end, but maybe that's a debate we can have at another time. I've been an environmental health officer since the mid-80s, working first in the UK and then over in Australia, before transitioning to academia, first in the UK and then in Australia later on. And I teach a broad range of environmental health and population health subjects, and I contribute to the teaching at Western Sydney University in the environmental health course. And I've actually helped teach in Massey as well, so I'm very familiar with the course that they've got. A fantastic course, and absolutely great students came across in New Zealand, and hopefully with COVID at some point sort of either becoming disappearing or becoming a normality, can get back to actually to Massey and sort of continue the teaching that was done over there, because it's great fun to travel and do that. But so without further ado, I'll move on to the presentation, if it works. So how much has really changed is the first question in environmental health over the years, because the history and the sort of the source of the sanitarian or the sanitary police goes all the way back to the sort of the late 1800s, where the inspector of nuisances or the sanitary inspector would actually be looking at sort of hot pies and looking down drains at myalgias and odours that were offensive. So the first question is really sort of how much has changed in what we are. And what's actually involved. Is it still all about food and foul odours? And are we more like a police force or a public health police force? And the simple answer to me is maybe we should recalibrate and rebadge ourselves, but then maybe not, because I don't think that's exactly what we are. I think we're much more than that, and we have to be sort of a little bit smarter in what we actually, how we see ourselves. But we're not necessarily the best at advocating and actually sort of championing what we actually are and what we actually do. That tends to be the doctors and the other public health professionals, but environmental health has got a need to actually champion what we do and actually sort of sing from the tallest points possible, the sort of the successes and the strengths that we actually have in this space. Because without environmental health, thousands of practitioners, you heard that in North America they've got 6,000 plus members, and we're going to hear from a colleague, Julie Barrett from the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health later on, and the membership there is in the thousands as well, as is across Australia, thousands of EHOs or practitioners. So we are a significant body of individuals. In fact, the International Federation of Environmental Health reckons that there's somewhere around about 40,000 members practicing environmental health around the world in all the continents. And that's without counting South America, which unfortunately isn't a member of IFEH at this time. So with 40,000 practitioners, we have to be developing this body of practice, this body of knowledge, and sharing our best practice to actually become that champion. And that's for us as professionals to actually take these ideas forward. So I was basically saying that we don't see ourselves as practitioners as a police force. We see ourselves more as educators and interventionists, but we have the legislation behind us. And the only time we tend to wear a high-vis jacket is when there's a risk of an accident, or we're actually using it as PPE. And I've certainly never worn a cap like that in any of my dealings in environmental health. And I hope we never do. That would not be a sort of a good thing to do. So moving on. This is sort of the Temperatures of Health from Barton and Grant in 2006, and it's really what's called the public health map. And if you look at the map itself, you actually say, well, where does the environmental health practitioner or environmental health officer influence? Well, actually, when you start analysing this map, you actually influence at all levels. So you're dealing with the public, you're dealing with businesses, you're dealing with corporations, you're dealing with development, you're dealing with the environment, you're dealing with whether it's water, streets, markets, or sort of networks of individuals. We cut across all those different components in different ways. We influence and we affect how people do things and how things change. But we do it quietly and we do it subtly. We don't necessarily champion the role that we actually have, which is I think I suggest that we actually should be doing much more of, to give that visibility. But we're not there to compete or say that we're the best. We do it collegially. We do it we do it in consultation. We do it in collaboration. That was the word. We do it in collaboration with our colleagues with the broader public health field. But when you talk to the public health professionals, they tend to be focused on the curative interventions. They tend to be focused on dealing with people who are sick, whereas what we're trying to do is environmental health. We're there in that precautionary, preventative role, where we're actually trying to sort of improve the well-being and the environment where we actually sort of live to reduce the threats that are actually out there and the stressors that are actually there within the environment that we actually work. So we cover everything from climate change to biodiversity and move in and out of the the layers that are actually defined here within this well-being model. And that's really important for us to actually hark back onto that. And it was great to hear Tanya mentioned about the One Health approach, because that's something that is very high level sort of strategic thinking at the top level of intergovernmental and NGO agencies. But that has the effect on the ground of delivering a healthier environment and working sort of in collaboration. And that's something that we've got to be working towards as the professionals. As EHOs or EH professionals, we often get not ring fenced, but we get put in a box, and our influence is much greater than that. And people tend to segment us and say, oh, this is what you do, this is what you need to do. But we're much more, we're interdisciplinary, we're multi-skilled, and that recognition has got to come forward. And with NEHANS, REHIS and CIH and other the professional bodies are all striving to do that, as is Environmental Health Australia, championing what we do and what we can offer. Because if you look at the practitioners within Australia alone, we work in local government, we work in state government, we work in at the universities. We're in the profession and in that broad influence all the time, making sure that what we do is actually sort of effective, and combining with the practitioner and the researcher gives us publications, which is what hopefully sort of influences and changes things. And having professionals in the policy units in public health at state, and hopefully influence the Commonwealth ideas, the sort of national government, national direction. This is where we have to be seen and have to be felt and have to sort of champion what we do. So moving on, not too quickly, this is how environmental health is really portrayed as a practitioner. I think it's a really great reference point to come back to, because it shows that transition from One Health and into this the actual sort of well-being and stressor model into where we can actually have those influences and where these problems actually come from, and the contribution that environmental health practitioners have in actually sort of working within the air, the land, the built environment, looking at water and food, and where we actually sort of can change that living environment, looking at the biological, chemical and the physical stressors. But we've also brought in the social and the psychosocial stressors, and look at ways to actually sort of the technical interventions and the practical and the policy interventions. And this is really the root of what we're about, and where we actually need to be sort of referring back to at all times. The next slide is really saying where we actually sort of have that influence and what it is we actually do, that we part about championing ourselves, to be seen to be partners and players within that health quality sort of matrix, and letting government see what we can deliver, and that we're not just that local government traditional enforcement tool. We're actually much more than that, where we're there to actually reduce those health inequalities. So it's about picking the stories and picking the sort of the examples where we've had great success, working with the professional bodies, working with the academics to publish those things. And that's something that the International Federation of Environmental Health is very keen to do, to take the stories and to take the anecdotes and take where things have actually been sort of successful, and also to reflect upon the failures where things haven't been as successful, and what are the lessons learned we can actually build upon. So all this goes into the mix about what we're trying to achieve as an environmental health practitioner, not just the EHO on the ground, but the EHO looking at the ground, solving problems, but looking broader and wider into the determinants of health, and looking at the broader population health issues, because we're into that strategic space, not just the operational space, but it's having networks to communicate, networks to work with, and as I said before, that collaborative approach to actually publishing best practice. This is where we have to probably change our game slightly and actually sort of stand up to be counted, because we are an asset and a resource to be used. But if we sit back passively, then things will pass us by, I believe. So just about at the end of the presentation now, this is I think the penultimate slide, and it's about where are the areas that we can influence, where are the areas we actually work best at. And it's a combination of saying what we do and what we need to do, and how we can actually sort of influence wider than this traditional sort of, from the first slide, just the food inspector and the inspector of nuisances and odours, and looking for the myalgias. We're much broader than that now. We're much more technically competent. Our courses are degree level and master's level. We encourage people to do CPD training. We encourage them to join the professional bodies. And the professional bodies there to represent as members on working parties at national level, and create those influences through the working bodies such as nHealth within the Australia New Zealand setup. So we're there to sort of to look at the maintenance of health, and we're not there as a curative agency, and we work in partnership with the public health professionals, but we need to champion that prevention component that we actually sort of focus on, and that's really what we're best at as well, maintaining people's sort of health and removing those sort of physical, chemical, biological stressors and the social and psychosocial stressors, where we can actually look at, we have great problem solving skills. Now, we've had many debates about how you actually sort of test that. It's not really a great, academics are not great at actually looking at those softer professional tools, but that's something that the profession is around the world have been sort of struggling to actually see. How do you get your practitioner to actually demonstrate these problem solving skills, the softer skills, the interpersonal skills, the negotiating skills, how to deal with violence and aggression. It's a very difficult thing for academics to teach, but it's a combination of working with the professional body and the academic to actually sort of create this newer sort of multi-skilled, multi-tooled graduates. They have the legal powers, they have the ability to sort of do interventions. They have a sort of a toolbox of many tools, not always statutory, but using the softer skills I've just mentioned, and covering the sort of the workplace and the home and the community. Different jurisdictions and different around the world do much more work in the housing sort of space than others, and that's maybe where we need to be looking and talking broader about how we can actually sort of have a more level playing field for our practitioners and for our influences, where we can actually be seen to be contributing sort of creatively and constructively. Maintaining health and healthy environments and protecting future generations, all looking forward in that strategic space, and supporting local health organisations, using the membership bodies for what they actually are. So I'm happy to take questions. I'd like to thank Environmental Health Australia for the invitation. I am a chartered member of the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health. I'm a chartered member of Royal Environmental Health Institute of Scotland, and have been since the early 80s, or as a member, and then chartered when it became. And as I say, I sit on the board at IFEH, and we're always happy to hear from members of member organisations and take on board what they've got to say and to talk about. And as I say, I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your presentation, Andrew. I love the reference to disproving miasma theory. I made that point at a conference a number of years ago, that some of our legislation seemed to be still based on miasma theory, which is a bit of an insight. I think it's so important that we move with the science, and that part of what every professional does out there is to engage in continuing professional development. Anyone who's been reading about vaccines at the moment, I think it's just about a full-time job to try and keep up to speed with the research being done in that area on COVID vaccines. So I couldn't agree with you more about the need to move with the science and stay up to speed with things. But we'll turn it over to questions now. I think we've got one that's popped up there.
So will environmental health practitioners get the recognition the profession deserves post-COVID? Probably not. It's a reality, but we will work hard, and we will shout loud, and some people will listen, and it will be a mixed bag. I know, as I say, I'm part of the UK setup as well, that there's talk of having a chief environmental health officer for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and that's a post that used to exist, that was chopped out in the 70s, and it'd be really nice to see it coming back, because it gives you that focal point. And it's always been a challenge for government, that where does environmental health sit Is it within the Department of Primary Industry? Is it within the built environment? And is it within environmental protection? Is it within construction? Is it within health? Who owns environmental health? And we've got too many masters to some extent. And that's where this concept of having a chief health officer comes in, chief environmental health officer. So it comes out of, if necessary, the health and public health setup and looks much broader across the different ministries. And that's what we're really sort of seeing as maybe one of the ways forward. What's the biggest difference between EHOs around the world? When you really look at it, there isn't much of a difference. They've got different training requirements and different experiences. But food safety in the UK is food safety in Australia. And it's the same in New Zealand. It's not that different in Papua New Guinea. It's not that different in Fiji. And when you're looking at HACCP, it's the same the world over. We have those common standards. So we have the application of common knowledge. And I've facilitated EHOs going over to the UK to work and get work experience. And they said that. They said, we thought it was going to be really challenging, but we got there. And salmonella is still salmonella. Sort of lead in the water is still lead in the water. So there is differencing standards. But again, traveling around the world, you see that we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to maintain a safer environment. And that goes for our colleagues in Africa, in the Middle East, etc., and close to home in Malaysia and the Philippines and Indonesia. EHOs the world over have all got this common motivation, I believe, and a lot of transferable skills. But there's still a lot of space to learn off of each other. And again, that's something that the IFEH is really keen to do, to look at reciprocation, to look at exchanges. Excuse me. We've had people in Australia come over from Zambia. I think they came over a couple of years ago. Excuse me. So there's great opportunities to go and share your skills and knowledge, but also to gain knowledge from colleagues. Excuse me. Frog in the throat. So I think there's a lot of similarities, more similarities than differences probably. And when you start talking to EHOs in those other countries, the conversations always get around to food poisoning, unfortunately, diarrhea, vomiting, and all these wonderful topics. But that shows you we're all the same. It's not a fascination or a morbid curiosity. It's just that's the business. And we love talking and we love sharing ideas. But I've talked too much. So,
thank you very
much.
Thanks very much for your contribution to World Environmental Health Day, Andrew. Much appreciated. And we've had a couple of questions there, but we will move on. It was always going to be a very tight schedule, this one, but thank you again.
No, thanks for the invitation. Good luck.
All right, moving on. I'm pleased to introduce another Australian environmental health professional as our next speaker. Jessica Spencer is a proud Wiradjuri woman from the central west of New South Wales and has been in the role of Regional and Aboriginal Environmental Health Project Officer for the New South Wales Health Aboriginal Environmental Health Unit for the last 6 years. Hi, Jessica, and welcome to the live chat.
So I'm delighted to share with you one of the most rewarding environmental health programs that I've been involved in. The Indigenous Communities Companion Animal Health Program, or referred to as ICCAP, or the Animal Health Program throughout this presentation, is a joint partnership between New South Wales Aboriginal Environmental Health Unit and the New South Wales Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. But if you take anything away from this presentation today, I want it to be 3 simple messages. 1, Aboriginal people love pets as much as any other Australian. 2, if the animals are healthy, then the people are likely to be healthy. And 3, if our immediate living environment, that is our homes, land, country, yard space, any space we share with our animals, family and friends, if that place is healthy, then the animals and the people are likely to be healthy also. Okay, next slide. Well, no, it's not moving. Sorry, Sam. So the Animal Health Program has taken me to some great places, but often disadvantaged communities. It's allowed me to meet and friend many people and feel gratitude in an abundance. I've seen the impact of limited veterinary services resulting in poor health and nuisance pet behaviours. And importantly, these programs have taught me to see the difference between poverty and neglect. Look at all my pictures. Do you see smiles and cuddles? That's because most people love their animals. They are attending our animal health program and getting the pets the healthcare they need. Our evidence is not just observational though. An evaluation study of 52 animal owners between 2018 and 19 who participated in our animal health programs from 5 communities found that 100% of people said that their dog was part of their family, and just over half said that they fed and cared for other animals in the community. In the same study, 94% of respondents identified the most common barriers to accessing veterinary services were cost and transport. And I'm clicking on the next slide. It's taking forever to move over, sorry. I should be on the 3rd slide, Sam. So the RSPCA delivered 2 versions of the animal program, with health depending on the remoteness of the area. A full program can run from a 1 to 5 day program in remote areas like Wilkenya or Brewarrina, where veterinary services are not available. For some of these locations, closest vets can be 2 to 4 hours away. In these programs, the RSPCA require temporary registration with the Veterinary Practitioners Board to approve a building to be used as a field hospital. During the full program, desexing occurs on the day at the approved site. The second version of the program are called Healthy Pet Days and are usually a 1-day event in communities where a vet service exists, places such as Walgett and Kempsey, and desexing can be organised through the local vets at a future date. So I'm not a vet. My role is more about establishing the program and ensuring the needs of community are met. Numerous communities have received an ICCAP program over the last 6 years. Most of these have been in Western, Far West or on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. In most of these locations, key stakeholders have included those listed on the slide, and I'll just mention local government, as they seem to have come more on board in the more recent years. I guess they realise that the animal projects provide an opportunity for their Shire Animal Officer or the Ranger to work with the community, not in their usual enforcement role. And on most of the projects, the Ranger or Animal Officer assists in a positive role with transport, education and microchipping. Services offered by the Animal Project, or with the owner's consent of course, include, and I won't mention them all, but desexing, and this is the core of what the RSPCA do to humanely control the population. We know that less animals means better cared for and healthier animals. The program vaccinates dogs and cats, particularly against parvovirus. It provides treatment for internal and external parasites such as ticks, fleas, mites, and gastrointestinal parasites. It provides an opportunity for people who may want to surrender sick or unwanted animals. Depending on the proximity to other towns, we always try to rehome and only euthanize the animals if they're too ill or injured or unfriendly. Do microchipping, the vets can do some minor work on ears and skin wounds, etc. And most importantly, we educate and we promote responsible pet ownership, as well as discuss diseases associated with dogs and cats, like parvo, other zoonoses such as Q fever. So why is health involved? As I mentioned, I'm not a vet. I work in the Aboriginal Environmental Health Unit for the Ministry of Health, and our core business is training Aboriginal people to become great environmental health officers, and we deliver a Housing for Health project. The Housing for Health methodology is based on 9 healthy living practices, and healthy living practice number 6 is to reduce the negative effects of animals and vermin. So animal health projects improve the health of the animals, therefore reducing their negative effects on people, and that's why health is involved in animal programs. In Australia, around 62% of households have a pet, and this is the same for Aboriginal people. Unfortunately, some of our regions are better serviced than others when it comes to veterinary care. And our animal health program in New South Wales is a small plug in a huge hole in ensuring pet care is accessible and available to all. Better access to vet services is needed across Western New South Wales and more broadly across other remote parts of Australia. And I guess health are really involved as animal health projects make great pathways to discuss other environmental and public health issues, such as hand washing, especially after touching animals, cleaning up after your cat and dog, keeping your sandpits covered, yard maintenance, waste removal, pest control projects about food sources and harbourage areas. And really, bonding with people over their animals is great for relationship building. If people can see that you care for them and their pets, that can mean a lot to someone. So this year, we had a Healthy Pet Day at an Aboriginal medical service for the first time, and this was due to a recent cluster of APSGN cases in that small town. So put simply, APSGN is a strep bacteria that starts with a sore throat or a skin infection, and if left, it can infect your blood and make your kidneys fail. So on this project, I worked with the Communicable Disease Unit with New South Wales Health and with the Western New South Wales Public Health Unit and my unit, and we collaborated before the Healthy Pet Days to establish some clear messaging around skincare. I know it's hard to believe, but occasionally scheduled programs coordinate in with the local issues and in the community. We were actually able to deliver timely and targeted relevant public health responses to the current situation. So on the flyer there, you can see some of the other agencies that were involved in the Healthy Pet Day, and the majority of them are local to the community. So pet owners on the day also received a Keeping Your Skin Healthy brochure that we created quickly, and a skincare pack consisting of items shown here in this picture, Band-Aids, betadine, etc. Firstly, I should say there's no evidence that pets can transmit the strep A bacteria to humans. We combine the messaging of keeping your skin healthy with our Healthy Pet Days because common sense tells us that if the dog is scratching because of fleas, then the kids who live in the same shared space are probably scratching also. This scratching could be creating sores and entry points for strep infection. So I just need to repeat, there's no evidence that pets can transmit strep A bacteria to humans. Results of Healthy Pet Day, and this Healthy Pet Day was actually ran across 2 days on 3 different sites. So 1 day at the AMS and 2 half days on 2 Aboriginal reserves. And over that time, we did 94 domestic animals with parasite treatments and health checks, and booked 46 more in for desexing at a later date with the local vet, and 15 animals were able to be rehomed. Probably most importantly, around 100 people received skincare packs and a 2-minute conversation on prevention of Group A strep. So as you can see, our Healthy Pet Days are quite well attended by many different groups of people. So I'm glad that health is involved in animal programs and that I can promote a One Health message in Aboriginal communities in Western New South Wales. I believe health also has a role to play in early detection of new and emerging diseases that might impact both animals and humans, and one of those being the emerging animal disease of Ehrlichia canis. In May 2020, Ehrlichia canis was first detected in dogs in the Northern Territory in WA, and they've found Ehrlichia in ticks in South Australia also. So the disease is spread by the bite of a brown dog tick, and as shown on this map in the dark area, the brown dog tick is found in numerous areas of New South Wales, including some of the places where our animal health programs are delivered. And Ehrlichia is really awful for the pet owners to witness. So dogs with Ehrlichia present with unusual bleeding, often from their nose, weight loss, fever, nasal discharge, and cloudy eyes. And treatment is by course of antibiotics that needs to be given for 28 days. So in some Aboriginal communities in WA and the Northern Territory, we're hearing reports and estimates of 30% of dog populations dying from Ehrlichia, and animal welfare groups like AMRIC, the Animal Management in Rural and Remote Indigenous Communities, are concerned about the trauma of witnessing dogs dying in large numbers. So preventing Ehrlichia in dogs requires regular tick treatment. Again, cost and transport become barriers to providing this type of preventative animal care, and as many remote and regional area shops do not stock appropriate medication for tick prevention, even here in New South Wales. Surveillance for ehrlichiosis at the moment in New South Wales relies on the district and private vets, and we already know from our animal health programs that these veterinary services don't exist in remote and regional locations where we go, the same places where the tick may live. And we already know that Aboriginal people in these areas are limited by funds and transport to seek veterinary care at the nearest location, should they be able to afford the medication required. So these populations may go unnoticed and be most affected for Ehrlichia in the future. And I want you now to just think back quickly to the happy people that I showed you 10 minutes ago, or those people who love their pets and bring them to an annual animal health clinic. How do you think they would feel if they saw 30% of their dog population die in a short period of time? Well, I can tell you that pets are like family to Aboriginal people, and losing any of them would be sad for the owner, but entire populations of dogs in one hit could be catastrophic to the mental health and well-being of some residents in smaller communities. So health need to be more involved in animal projects, in understanding the positive as well as the negative impact of pet ownership. In the future, healthcare may not just be about fixing up dog bite wounds, attending dog attacks, or preventing the spread of zoonotic disease, but it might be about providing the emotional, mental support that will be needed if our fur friends and fur family members were all to get sick and pass away. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I couldn't agree more. I worked for a period of time, Central Desert area, Western Australia, up until middle of last year, and the dog programs are an integral part of Indigenous communities. And yeah, very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. It just shows the depth and breadth of what we get involved in with environmental health. I might ask one question, if I may. Have you had any covenant program in Western New South Wales? We were utilising covenant in the Central Desert area to prevent female dogs coming on heat. Have you undertaken anything along those lines?
No, so most of it is permanent desexing, although during COVID, where we've only been able to run Healthy Pet Days, the vets have been using some temporary sterilisation as well. Okay.
Excellent. Thanks very much. We've got a question popped up there for you.
So roughly, I guess, a full program of between, 3 to 4 days could cost around 15 to 20,000. All of them are funded a little bit differently. So in some cases, local government come on board and provide vouchers for desexing at their local vet. And I know that the Department of Health in New South Wales is really open to looking at different models, because we realise that we probably have the RSPCA at capacity. But a Healthy Pet Day is probably around $10,000, depending on the size of a town and the number of people, animals that you would get through. And I just should say that treating acute rheumatic fever or APSGN in the hospital could potentially cost the health department $600,000 for open heart surgery. So preventing kids from having skin sores or sore throats is really important. And, by providing education through an animal or an environment, it's really important.
Yes, thanks you very much, Jessica. Yeah, certainly agree. And thanks again for your presentation. Moving along, and hopefully with no technical difficulties, Dr. Jamal Hisham is our next speaker for this live chat. He is a director of Provenue Corporation, which specialises in health risk and impact assessment. He was formerly a research fellow at the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health and Malaysia's first appointed professor of environmental health at the National University of Malaysia. He's also an editor of Environmental Analysis, Health and Toxicology, and Frontiers in Occupational Health journals. Welcome, Dr. Hisham. Thank you for taking the time today to join us.
Thank you, Phil. Good afternoon from Malaysia. It's afternoon here at 12 p.m. And I would like to thank Environmental Health Australia for this opportunity and the invitation to participate in the live chat. Okay, today I'll be talking about managing the risk of zoonotic diseases in Malaysia. Lately, this has become somewhat of a problem here. So we are strategizing on how to manage the risk of zoonotic diseases in Malaysia. Next slide. Okay, basically what I'll be talking about today is what are zoonotic diseases. Just now, a few speakers have already touched on this, and I will bring it into context on what we experience here in Malaysia. Looking at the endemic zoonotic diseases in Malaysia, And then I will discuss a number of problematic zoonotic diseases here in Malaysia. I think many have heard about the Nipah virus, which was a zoonotic diseases which was identified in Malaysia, and some research work that are done on leptospirosis and malaria, and also the approach of One Health concept, which one speaker has talked about earlier. Next slide. Okay, basically, I think many of you are aware that zoonotic diseases are caused by pathogen that spread between animal and people. And in the present world, where we have close encounter between animals and people, then the opportunity for zoonotic diseases to flourish become much easier. And they can be due to various number of harmful pathogens like viruses, bacteria, and parasites. And scientists has estimated that more than 60% of known infectious diseases in Malaysia can be spread from animal. And the disease burden of zoonotic diseases is quite significant, where 2.5 billion cases of zoonotic diseases has been identified, with 2.7 million deaths. And what is more worrying is that many of the emerging infectious diseases, 3 out of 4, are zoonotic in nature. We have the H1N1, SARS, MERS, Ebola, and so on. This according to CDC. Next slide. Okay, these are the prevailing or the current endemic situation of the zoonotic diseases in Malaysia in 2019, just before the COVID-19 epidemic. Dengue, as you all know, is endemic in Malaysia and has been a problem for some time. So it is quite significant. Although dengue now is a human disease, but originally came from animals, so it does qualify as a zoonotic disease as well. Malaria is well under control, but in some areas of Malaysia in the interior, we still have a problem of malaria. But what is worrying, recently we have increased incidence of leptospirosis due to interaction between human, water, and rodents. For rabies, Malaysia was declared rabies-free in 2013 by the World Animal Health Organization. But unfortunately, we had an outbreak in 2015. So currently, there is a disease, rabies outbreak in one of the states in Malaysia that we're trying to control. Next slide. Before this, yeah, okay. So I think this was something that many have heard about the incident of Nipah virus in Malaysia, which was a disease transmitted from swine or pig to human. And the outbreak happened in 1998, which causes 265 cases and 105 deaths. Genetically, it has some resemblance to the Hendra virus that appeared in Australia before that. And what was interesting is that in 1998 was following the year that we experienced the El Nino or the severe drought. And it has affected the fruiting failure of the forestry where the bat survive and feed on. And this has made them migrated to nearby human communities, usually pig farm, and that's how the disease got transmitted from bat to pigs and then to the pig farmers. And what was very alarming was that the mortality rate was very high, 75%. Fortunately, the disease subsided, and I think now there are appearance of this virus and disease in India. Next slide. Malaysia being a tropical country, hot and wet, we are often experience very heavy rainfall, and flooding is an annual event. But what happened in 2014 was a major flooding event in the eastern state of Peninsular Malaysia, so much so that it was reported that the annual rainfall over a year fell in just 1 week. So there was a huge, severe flooding event in 2014, and it caused a lot of tragedy in terms of death due to drowning and also diseases related to water-borne diseases. But what was also obvious was the leptospirosis outbreak during and following the major flooding event. So we did a study from one of my PhD students, and it has been published in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Next slide. Yeah, so you can see here from the graph the rainfall, the very sharp increase in rainfall before the flood period, depicted by the red colored graph, and then there was a lag of few weeks followed by a spike in the leptospirosis cases as shown by the black line. Okay, so what initially we expected that when the flood water recede, we should expect the leptospirosis cases to also come down, subside. However, we noticed that even after the flood has long gone, there were a subsequent spike, and it took some time, months, before the leptospirosis cases really come down. Next slide. And when we look further, what we found was that these cases were very much associated with the garbage or waste disposal site, which were haphazardly constructed after the flood event to cater for the huge amount of debris and waste that were generated during the flood. And when we used the GIS technique, we saw that almost all the major cases were concentrated around this garbage disposal site. Yeah? So that was a lesson learned for us. Even when the flood has subsided and gone, that doesn't mean that problem related to communicable diseases will also disappear. So we have to manage our environment better, especially the garbage disposal mechanism. Yeah. Okay. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that malaria is on the decline in most part of Malaysia, but in one state in Sabah, which is on the island of Borneo, sharing border with Indonesia, Kalimantan, malaria can still be a problem. It's endemic there. And what is interesting is that there is a shift now from traditional malaria caused by Plasmodium vivax and falciparum to this parasite called Plasmodium knowlesi. And Plasmodium knowlesi is very much a zoonotic origin. It is associated with the long-tailed macaque primate, and we were curious what could be the driving force behind this Plasmodium knowlesi. So we use artificial intelligence to model the progression of the disease, and the three factors that came out to be significant was rainfall, land surface temperature, and NDVI. NDVI is a normalized different vegetation index. So we found that the rainfall and temperature has an ideal condition which help to propagate this malaria. So certain range of rainfall and temperature will also facilitate the transmission of this malaria caused by Plasmodium nosai. But another interesting thing is that the certain form of vegetation, mostly disturbed vegetation, disturbed forest that has been turned into plantation. So what happened is that when that happened, the interaction between primates and human become more intense and help to propagate the disease. Next slide. Oh, one slide behind. I think one slide before. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah, and although this is not confirmed yet, and speculative, but recently a researcher from the France Pasteur Institute and a researcher from Laos have identified COVID-like virus, COVID-19-like virus in bat species, in northern Laos. So there's always a possibility that what we are experiencing now with COVID-19 may also have an animal origin, just like its predecessor, SARS, which was associated with civet cat. Next slide. Yeah. So this has been touched by the previous speaker. So one of the approach that we should embark on in looking at zoonotic diseases, obviously, is the One Health concept, which recognizes that the health of people is closely connected with the health of animal and shared environment. And it calls for integrated approach, as mentioned by the CDC, to involve experts from human, animal, and environmental health. So I'm happy that environmental health was specifically mentioned here in monitoring and controlling public health threats, and to learn how diseases spread among people, animal, plant, and environment. And actually, One Health concept not only focus on zoonotic diseases, but also other aspects of antimicrobial resistance, food safety, security, vector-borne diseases, environmental contamination, and so on. Next slide. Okay, so basically, we are part of the environment, as well as the animals and the physical environment, and so to manage it well and to make everybody healthy, we need to integrate everything in One Health concept, as shown here in the Lancet Commission, the Lancet One Health Commission. Next slide. Okay, I think this is my last slide. In management of zoonotic diseases, we foresee that this will probably be the new challenge for Malaysia and also for the rest of the world. And so we should soon incorporate this One Health approach in management of zoonotic diseases. And I think environmental health practitioners can play a pivotal role alongside other professionals like physicians, veterinarian, microbiologists, animal scientists, and epidemiologists in trying to better understand the interaction between animal, man, and environment. And in many Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, animal husbandry is a big industry, but they are not very organized and centralized. So we, for example, are trying very hard to centralize our animal farm, so that they are more better managed and controlled. And also in some of the Southeast Asian country, we still have live animal being sold in market, dry and wet market. I think you are all aware of the Wuhan seafood market, which was the place where the first cases of COVID-19 was identified. And also we have this problem in development with deforestation and habitat destruction that will increase the interaction between wild animal and man, and many of the diseases that are presently confined to the wildlife may make the jump to human and cause this zoonotic problem. And another big issue that we are facing now is the international wildlife trafficking. You can see there the pangolin Yeah, pangolin. This is very sought after by traditional medicine practitioner. It's a $1 million black market industry, and we are trying very hard to apprehend this criminal. And Malaysia is one of the trade route that they usually use in this trafficking. Okay, I think with the interest of time, that's pretty much what I'm able to present to you, and hopefully this gives you some insight on the situation that we have in Malaysia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hisham. That's a fantastic presentation. You've encapsulated a whole series of environmental health issues in a very succinct presentation, so thank you for that. The implications for climate change, I think, are more than demonstrated with the example that you gave with flooding, and the sort of things that we're going to be confronted with into the future with severe storms and that sort of thing. And certainly, we all wonder, SARS, MERS, COVID-19, what's next? So it's probably just a matter of time. But certainly zoonosis is a real issue moving forward. So it looks like we've got a question there for you.
Yeah. Are there laws to curb wildlife trafficking in Malaysia? Yes, we have the law on paper, at least. We have the Wildlife Conservation Act 2010, and it is being enforced more strictly now. Yeah? Maybe we have overlooked this issue before, but the penalty can be up to $500,000 ringgit and up to 5-year jail. And the enforcement officer are very active now, trying to curb this menace. But unfortunately, they are a part of a very organized syndicate, international syndicate, not just operating in Malaysia. And it also can be quite dangerous for the enforcement officer. But we have seen a few cases now being taken to court and a few criminals being punished for this act. Yeah, hopefully it will help to curb the problem in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question there.
Yes. So this is pretty alarming. We can see MERS and then now COVID-19, before that SARS and all that. They are very much respiratory diseases, and being so, they are easily transmitted from animal to man and from human to human. So we, in Malaysia, we have already started the surveillance program in terms of influenza-like illness and severe acute respiratory infection, I think, which is a mechanism that is being promoted globally. Yeah, but I think we need to further upgrade our system so that it's more digitized. You know, I know, for example, in countries like China, they have a very good influenza surveillance system that is highly digitized and well organized. So, but in Malaysia, we have not reached that level. But taking stock from what is happening now with COVID-19, I think that is something that we need to seriously look into so that we can detect any problem very early in the stage. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And thank you very much for joining us from Malaysia. And like I said, it was a wonderful presentation, encapsulated a number of issues and very, very relevant for our theme today. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Yes.
All right, our final speaker today is Julie Barrett. And poor Julie, we got her up at a ridiculously early hour in England, and now we've kept her waiting because we're running a bit late. But Julie is a chartered EHP and a barrister. She practiced environmental health in Northern Ireland, England and Wales for 10 years, and spent 20 years practicing law in private practice and in local government, specialising in regulatory law. She took up the post of president of the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health in 2021. Welcome, Julie. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Apologies for the appalling light here. You'll see the sun hasn't come up yet here, but nonetheless, I'm delighted to be here. I'm talking to you today about environmental health and healthy environments. It's a big issue for us because obviously we've got COP26 in Glasgow coming up, and because our Prime Minister has been talking about climate change in the US only yesterday. So I want to talk about environmental health and healthy environments, but more particularly the role of environmental health in healthy environments, because that matters so much to all of us. If I could have my first slide, please. You hardly need me to tell you what the traditional role of environmental health is. We're involved in housing, in food, water, air and pest control, and those are our traditional stamping grounds. We've been doing this for well over 100 years and we are well versed in it. But it's fair to say that things are changing now faster, I think, than they've ever changed. Even looking back over my own career, things are changing faster than they ever did. And just by way of giving you an example, you can see the effect that climate change is having in Wales, where we're famous for relatively poor summer weather and quite a lot of rain. On the 8th of September, so just the beginning of this month, we're having our warmest September night since records began. Now, this isn't going to take your breath away in Australia, I get that, but believe me, this is big news in Wales. We've had minimum 24-hour temperature of 20.5 degrees C, which smashed a record which is 72 years old. By some significant amount, well over a degree. Following 3 days of unusually warm weather in September, with parts of Wales reaching 28 degrees. That's a big change for us. We can see climate change coming. It's not just sporadic good weather. We have evidence of climate change coming. And if climate change is coming, we in environmental health have to be responding to it. Recognizing that we have a role to play. Now, it's a big issue, climate change. It's not the small local issue that we're used to dealing with. It's a global issue. So the question of how environmental health, and particularly how local environmental health services can contribute to turning climate change around is a good one. And it's one I'm asked a lot. You know, how does my contribution help? Which is really what I want to go on to consider. So if I could have my next slide, please. Looking first at housing, how and where we live is important. Wherever you look on the globe, a lot of the population lives in cities in high density accommodation. We're all piled on top of each other. It's changed a little bit, I should say. My experience of going to London post-COVID has shown that it's nowhere near as busy as it was. But be that as it may, there are still an awful lot of people living in not a great deal of space, generally in very high density accommodation. And much of it is on rivers. And an awful lot of it is on floodplains, because historically that's where we've lived for trade and communication purposes. But that has disadvantages when we start to get extreme weather events and the natural water sources start to flood. Certainly in the UK and most of Western Europe, our accommodation is not designed to cope with extreme heat and extreme cold, because that's just not something we're used to. The excess summer death figures in Paris were frightening a couple of years ago, as the elderly just died in homes that were not capable of dealing with extreme heat. Similarly, much of the property we have doesn't deal with extreme cold, because we're not subjected to extreme cold. So we get excess winter deaths related to people living in accommodation that just can't be kept warm, irrespective of how much money you throw at trying to do that. So if we recognise those are the issues, what's the role of environmental health in sorting them out? Well, first of all, I think we have to influence new design. We in the UK, I'm not sure what the position is around the world, but certainly in the UK, get to comment on planning applications. And we have to be commenting and saying, look, we need to be building in ways of dealing with extreme heat and extreme cold. We have to make our accommodation fit the climate and not the other way around. We can get involved in retrofitting adaptation. It's never as good as making sure that the properties are fit for purpose right from the start, but we have an awful lot of property with people living in it. We can't go back to a blank piece of paper. So retrofitting adaptations is important, whether it's air conditioning for the summer or whether it's insulation for the winter. We have to look at making buildings fit for purpose, and that's one of the things we should be doing. Certainly in the UK, we're talking to private landlords to make sure that the property they rent out is suitable, working with them to provide insulation grants and working with them to make sure that property is fit in the high summer when old properties get heat and hold it for a very long time. We also, I think, need to look at restyling cities as living places. All too often cities have developed as working places, but deserts in the evening, and we need to be looking at cities and saying we need to make these places where people choose to live rather than have to live, and are a place of last resort. One of the things we've seen as a result of COVID in the UK is people moving out of the city. People who have the wherewithal to sell up and move away from the city are doing that, which means I think that in a few years' time, we may find our cities populated by the super rich and the very poor. And that's hardly ideal. We need to be restyling cities as living places, taking account of climate change and making them more people friendly. And from the point of environmental health, we need to be advocating. We need to be seen to be saying these things, to be shouting from the rooftops, shouting at developers and shouting at planners, and making sure that people understand that homes are for people. They're not just accommodation. If I could have my next slide, please. So if that's the traditional housing, what about traditional food and what we eat? I think we have to recognise that traditional methods of food production may not be sustainable. That's clear as the population grows and, more importantly, as the population moves. Because of climate change, traditional methods of food production which take up a large amount of land and use a large amount of water may not be sustainable. And we're going to have to look at different ways of producing food. Now, whether it's different ways of producing food or different foods that we choose to eat, it doesn't matter. But the same old isn't always going to work. We also have to recognise that moving food around the planet significantly contributes to climate change. And it also significantly contributes to local food poverty. When it is more beneficial to a farmer to sell his food to a country that halfway around the globe than it is to feed his local population, we have to ask ourselves what's gone wrong. We have, particularly in the Western world, become very sophisticated in our food taste, and we want food from all around the world, and we want it available to us whenever we want it, which is fine. That's the way we've developed. But we have to recognise for the planet that's not necessarily the best way forward. And we also have to look at Frankenstein foods, food which is made. There's a huge industry developing in making food from non-traditional food ingredients, what we would call Frankenstein food. So making things that look like meat but aren't meat at all and are grown in the lab. And I checked yesterday how much energy it takes to make a Frankenstein non-meat beef burger. And it takes 27 times the energy of beef grazed on grass. So the fact that we can do it doesn't mean that we should do it. And we have to look at the damage to the planet that we're doing in looking for alternative ways of doing things we're already doing, but could possibly do better. So what are the solutions? Well, I can't offer all of them, but what I would suggest is we all need to be thinking about eating seasonally and eating locally. Eating seasonally when there is less impact on the planet, and eating locally, which generates less impact on the planet. Now, that may not be our choice, but it may be what we have to do pragmatically if we are going to reduce the impact of food on the planet. We certainly need to waste less. The figures that I was looking at yesterday suggested that in the UK, 30% of the food which is bought by consumers is wasted. That's a staggering amount. And it's an appalling waste of resource. You have to think that whatever is thrown in a recycling bin here, however good I feel about putting something in my recycling bin, you have to remember that a whole industry sits behind that, and it's just represented as waste. So the farmer, the haulier, the retailer, and finally straight into the recycling bin. We have to reduce our waste, whether it's in production, whether it's in what we should say retail, and whether it's the final consumer. Now, that's all things that people do. What does environmental health do? What do environmental health officers do? We advocate. We have to be talking about this. We have to be talking to government. We have to be talking to retailers. We have to be talking to food manufacturers, whether it's major manufacturers or whether it's small cafes and restaurants. We have to be advocating about not wasting food and talking to the consumer about not wasting food, ways of using food. And if at the end of the day it does get thrown out, composting it to make sure it gets back into the carbon cycle. If I could have my next slide, please. So traditionally, we've been very involved in clean water. If you look back to the roots of environmental health, we almost started in clean water, taking handles off pumps in the UK. We all know that water is critical for life in all its forms, and we all have different experiences of water. In Wales, we tend to have rather too much of it when we don't want it. I'm aware that there are other parts of the world that would very much like some of the rain that we have and don't get it, but it's critical for life in all its forms. We are seeing, looking globally, increasing episodes of drought and increasing episodes of flooding, and they don't offset each other. We can't say, well, you know, we've had drought, we'll have flooding, and ultimately they'll equalize out. They don't. They both have absolutely catastrophic local effects that take a very long time to recover from. They also cause populations to move. Populations follow water supply. We see it very much in animals. We very much watch programs with David Attenborough talking about animals moving around following water and fresh grass. But we're seeing it a lot in populations, particularly in Africa, moving to follow water supplies, where increased episodes of drought mean that it's just not possible to live in some areas. The population just moves to areas where there is water. Consequently, the pressure on water supply grows and grows until a greater population has to move. And they move to higher settlement areas. And listening to climate scientists talking, one of the things they are concerned about is the move of populations to follow water, which means that there will be increased population densities where there is water, and the possibility of conflict over availability of water. And we need to be thinking about that, and we need to be heading that off at the pass. So how do we do it? Well, particularly I think in Western Europe, we are very, very cavalier with our use of potable water. Just thinking about my own house, I use potable drinking water for flushing toilets, which is absurd. In a country where we have a huge amount of rainwater, that could be used for activities where potable water is not required. We need to be much more careful with our use of potable water and much more creative with our use of grey water. We also need to be much more cognizant of water security. The figures that we have for the UK suggest that something like 12% of potable water is lost before it ever gets to taps. Because the water system is so old, we lose so much to leakage. Only yesterday, there was a huge flood in Manchester because of a mains water pipe bursting. And that represents an enormous waste of treated water, and all of the energy and effort that's gone into treating it. It becomes a problem as it's pouring through houses and shops. Potable water security is a huge issue. And looking very much to the use of technology. There are parts of Europe, Gibraltar, for example, where the largest part of potable water comes from desalination. It doesn't come from falling from the sky. And as the climate changes, more and more countries are going to have to look at more and more creative ways of obtaining potable water. We can't just rely on it dropping out of the sky on us. Okay, they're big problems and they're expensive solutions, but I think the role of environmental health, again, is in advocacy, in talking, even at local level, to people about how they use water, ways of using grey water more creatively, ways of saving potable water, or at least reusing it after it's been used for showers, for example, to make it to grey water, which goes to a use rather than just pours away and soaks away. And being more realistic and accepting that it's not okay to water the lawn all day, every day with water which people could be drinking, because that is not an acceptable use of what is increasingly a finite resource. So again, it's advocacy for us, talking to people, making them recognize what's happening and trying to encourage them to change. If I could have my next slide, please. Perhaps, and irritatingly for us, the final of the 5 things that I've talked about as our core purpose is pest control. Why does it matter? Well, quite clearly, and from the 2 previous presentations, we know that the pests damage human health and they damage animal health and they destroy crops. They are a huge issue. Their life cycle means that they evolve faster than us, they outbreed us, and more than that, they out-adapt us. Now, when you can have 15 generations of mosquito in a summer, they are bound to out-evolve us. So whatever we do to control them, they are one step ahead of us and changing faster than we can change to catch up with them. They're also much more mobile than we are. They colonize areas that suit them and they move to new areas as the climate changes. One of the things that we are looking at in Europe is the way that pest species are moving up from Africa through southern Europe into the more temperate northern Europe. Pests that we've not dealt with, pests that we're not able to cope with, and pests that are looking at areas and thinking, happy days, we're moving into somewhere where there are none of our species we can just colonize at will. Pests are very good at exploiting human environments. And the nature of the climate change and the way we move about the planet means that pests can move about the planet. I've got an example on the slide of an Asian hornet. My husband is a beekeeper and spends most of his days now obsessing about the possibility of Asian hornets coming because they are enormously destructive of honeybee colonies. That we know that they're in the UK, we know they're moving up from the south of England. There is every expectation we will see Asian hornets in Wales this summer, and that's something we really need to be concerned about. So how are we going to deal with pest control? Well, first of all, we've got to learn from the host countries. What is it that the host countries of the pest species, the original host countries, do to control them? Learn from those countries and adapt what we do to match what they do to deal with the pests. What the Welsh Rugby Union is pleased to call getting its retaliation in first. Let's pest proof before the pests arrive, rather than deal with them when they get here. We also need to be on our guard. We know what pests are in countries with climates which are not dissimilar to ours. And as our climate changes to become more like theirs, we know that we will have these pests to deal with. When we're doing adaptations to housing, think about pest proofing adaptations at the same time, not for the pests that we have, but for the pests that we expect. Getting our retaliation in first, as I said. And the other thing we have to be so careful of is avoiding unintended consequences. We have been very poor in the past at introducing something to deal with a pest that has then become a major pest in its own right. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. And we need to advocate. We in environmental health are at the sharp end of pest control. It's not enough just to deal with it. We have to be talking about it. We have to talk to each other about when we come across pests, and we have to talk to the public about how to deal with them. It's not about drowning everything in chemicals, which have their own consequence. It's about dealing with it in more creative ways, so that we can make sure that in dealing with one issue, we don't raise another. So what would I like you to take away from this presentation? If I could have my final slide, please. I'm very keen on a comment that a colleague of mine, Dr. Hugh Brunt, who is the Chief Public and Environmental Health Officer for the Welsh Government, made once in a lucid moment. He said, "None of us knows as much as all of us." And that's true. We all know an awful lot, but we have to share it. We have to learn from each other, and particularly on climate change, because everyone's climate is changing to match someone else's. And everybody has experienced things before that other people need to learn from. So countries like Malaysia, which are used to flooding, we can learn from them in the UK as we increasingly deal with flooding. The world has never been so connected. I am sitting here at 6 a.m. in the morning talking to colleagues in Australia and all around the world, and it's a relatively easy thing to do. We've never been more connected, so we need to share what we know. We need to learn from each other, and we need to be open to learning from each other. But as EHOs, we need to speak truth to power. It's not enough to do the day job. We have to raise our profile and talk to people in power and say, look, we're the people on the ground. We know what's going on. You need to listen to us, because we can tell you the unvarnished truth, how it is. And we need to make the difficult calls. It's relatively easy to keep your head down and do the day job, but we need to raise our head above the parapet. And okay, we'll get shot at, but we need to be saying the things people don't want to hear. We need to be having the uncomfortable conversations. Because for too long, people have said to us, climate change, floods and extreme weather is a wake-up call. It's not a wake-up call. We've been awake to it for years. It's just people haven't listened. So we need to raise the questions. But I think we also need to be part of the answer. It's no good just shouting into the darkness. We also need to be proposing solutions. And going back through my slides, I have used the same format. What is the question, but what are the possible answers? And I think we need to be there raising the answers, not just because it's a good thing to do, because that's what we're about. Our motto here in the UK is Amicus Humani Generis, friend of the human race. I think we need to be a critical friend of the human race, and we also need to be a solution provider. And if we do that, we continue to be relevant in a world that is changing faster than most of us can keep up with it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Julie. And again, an informative and broad-ranging presentation for all our followers all over the world. So thank you very much for that. I note your comments on adaptation, and it's the same issue, different aspects that we're all dealing with. The east coast of Australia was absolutely buried in smoke last summer due to extensive bushfires, and I think there was coverage around the world. The smoke stretched all the way across to New Zealand from devastating bushfires. So the issues are the same for human health. They just vary in different sets of circumstances. I'm also cognizant of the comments that Dr. David Dijak has made on a number of occasions, that we need to look at these things holistically, and that in one context that it is a case that public health is the subset of environmental health, not the other way around. And we've had a number of comments today about One Health and the significance of that. So thank you very much for your presentation. Much appreciated. I think we can open up for a couple of questions. There's one there. Hopefully you can see it.
Yeah, why have I made a point of stressing advocacy? I think because we need to make our voices heard. We are the people who are at the sharp end. And yes, it is actions. Actions are important, but they don't necessarily speak louder than words if you're talking to the right people. We need to be raising our game and talking to government and making sure that government knows that we're there, what we can do, what we can deliver, but also what solutions we are proposing. I think the important thing about advocacy is not just to raise the question, but it's to be part of the answer. And that's an extremely important role for us, whether it's nationally or internationally. We need to be part of the answer, but we need to be part of the conversation, because if we're not part of the conversation will pass us by. And realistically, we're the people that know. We're the people on the front line. We know. We can propose the answers, and we need to be there doing it.
Excellent. I think you've got another one there, Julie.
Yeah, difference individual EHOs can make. It's a question I'm asked quite a lot. You know, I'm out on my district doing X, Y, and Z. How can I impact on climate change? Well, I think, you know, going back to my presentation, pretty much everything EHOs do will impact on climate change in a small way. So if you're a housing officer and you're improving someone's housing conditions, think about climate change in the small sense. How can you make this house more livable for the individual that's living in it? How can you make sure that climate change doesn't impact on them, whether it's by insulating the property against cold or dealing with the problem of excess heat, or making sure that they are using grey water when grey water could be used rather than potable water? All those things add up, and lots of little changes make a difference. All right, the individual EHO may not be able to change the world, but they can certainly change somebody's world. And if enough of us are doing it, we will make an impact. The dripping tap will eventually cause the tank to run out of water. And we have to think about ourselves like that. All of us are doing something, and the somethings will all add up.
Thanks very much, Julie. And thanks for a wonderful presentation. And and thanks for joining us. I realise it's very early over there, so your time is much appreciated. And thanks to everyone that's joined us today. We did miss one question from the previous presentation, which was, how important do you think entomology study is within environmental health studies? I'll answer that one myself and say that I think it's extremely important. We actually include it in our knowledge and skills matrix when we assess university courses. So I think that is something that's extremely important in environmental health studies, and quite often the challenge for us in Australia with our postgraduate courses is ensuring that that subject matter is adequately addressed in the degrees. So hopefully that's a bit of an answer for Anish. And again, thanks, Julie. I have to sort of sum up now, so I'll just say a few words about today's World Environmental Health Day. Despite what is going on around the world at this time, it's great that we can engage and, as Julie said, all come together in a way that we're so much more interconnected, and nothing more so than doing so on World Environmental Health Day. That concludes our World Environmental Health Day live chat this year. I hope everyone's enjoyed the event, and hopefully you've all learned something. I want to take this opportunity to again thank all of our fantastic speakers for taking the time to be a part of today's live chat and sharing their knowledge and experience with everyone. A series of brief but informative presentations like this is a great way to celebrate the day. Thanks again to our staff, and particularly to Sam for coordinating the event. And I think there was even a question about this earlier, but a recording of this chat will be made available via the EHA website in the coming weeks once Sam's had a chance to do a bit of editing. So keep an eye on the EHA social media channels for that announcement. So it will become available, and I encourage you to share it with as many colleagues as possible. Lastly, if you'd like more information on environmental health, EHOs or EHA, visit the Environmental Health Australia website by following the link seen on the screen. I think, yep, Sam has got that up there. thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy. I realise that the actual day is a couple of days away, but thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great World Environmental Health Day, and all the best. Stay safe.